Have your Bibles open to Hebrews chapter 5. That was our scripture reading a moment ago, but we're going to be looking in Hebrews chapter 5, and I want to notice here the broader context beginning in verse 7, and we're going to focus in particular on verse 8 here in just a moment. So notice Hebrews chapter 5 beginning in verse 7. It says, "In the days of his flesh," speaking of Jesus Christ, "he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." Now, there's a great deal of things that we could talk about from Hebrews chapter 5. The book of Hebrews is a marvelous, marvelous discussion of the superiority of Jesus Christ. As you work your way through the book of Hebrews, you notice time and time and time again the way the word better is used to describe Jesus. He's better than the angels in chapter 1. He's superior to Moses in chapter 3. His covenant is better. His blood is better. His sacrifice is better. Jesus, in a word, is better. But this great high priest of ours, this mediator of a new covenant, the one who bore our sins in his flesh and brought about redemption for us all, he had something to learn. Now, it's an odd phrase in Hebrews chapter 5, isn't it? That he learned something. I've always wondered about that. How is it that he could be divine, that he could be omniscient, all-knowing, and yet Jesus had something to learn? Now, let's establish a couple of facts before we move any further in this lesson. Fact number one is, Jesus, while dwelling in bodily form, was everything that it meant to be God. Notice in Colossians chapter 2 the way that it's described here. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 9 it says, "For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form." I like that verse. What that verse is saying is everything that it means to be God, the fullness of deity, not half deity, not a sampling of deity, but everything that it means to be God was dwelling in a body, a human body, by the way. In John chapter 1, it's very clear that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh, and He dwelt among us. He was a human being while also being fully God. And being fully God, that meant that the Son was omniscient, all-knowing, that He was omnipotent, all-powerful, that He was eternally pre-existent. He never had a beginning. He'll never have an end. Other passages like Colossians chapter 1 beginning in verse 15 also affirm these facts. It says there, "And He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." Not that He was the first one created, but that He holds the position of firstborn. He is the firstborn of all creation. "For by Him all things were created, both in the heavens and the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. All things have been created by Him and for Him." He affirms in the Gospel of John in several different passages. John chapter 10 and verses 37 and 38. John chapter 5 verses 17 through 19. John chapter 5 verse 36. That He is co-equal with the Father in terms of deity. So if all of these facts are true, if all of these things are true about Jesus, how is it possible that He learned something? Because even in the context of the book of Hebrews, where we get this idea of Him learning something in chapter 5 and verse 8, even in the context of Hebrews, it's stated that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His nature. And so put very simply, how can an omniscient being learn something? I mean, if I was to tell you that I knew everything, but then you told me who won a game today, well, then I didn't really know everything, did I? If I told you that I was omniscient, that I knew everything, and then you said, yeah, but who won the World Series in 1956? I don't know. Well, then I'm not really omniscient. So how can it be that Jesus is all God, the fullness of deity, everything it means to be God, but he had to come here to planet Earth to learn something? He learned obedience through his suffering. Something that he didn't know before, and then he knew. Maybe an analogy will help. I like confections. I'm an American after all. But let's say you had a recipe in front of you, okay? And you're wanting to make cupcakes, okay? Delicious, wonderful cupcakes, fill in the blank, whatever flavor you like. And you've got the recipe right in front of you, okay? And you know exactly how much flour is going to go into this cupcake. And you know exactly how much baking powder is going to go into this cupcake. And you know exactly how much butter, or how much sugar, or how much cream. And you know exactly how much of every ingredient is going to be in that cupcake. Now, you also know how to mix them, in what order to mix them together, how thoroughly to beat them together. And you know what receptacle to put them in. And you also know what temperature they're going to bake at. And you know for how long they're going to bake. And you know everything about these cupcakes except for what they taste like. You have a complete and thorough technical knowledge, the ins and the outs, every single thing in this cupcake, except for the experiential knowledge of what these cupcakes taste like. I think that's an analogy that we can use to understand a little bit better how an omniscient being who is co-equal with the Father can learn something here on planet Earth through his suffering. To be sure, the Son has vast and unimaginable knowledge of the creation. Everything from the subatomic to the galactic is held together by his will. We already read that in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 17. He knows how many hairs you have on your head. Luke chapter 12 and verse 7. He knows how many of your hairs are gray and how many of your hairs are supposed to be gray. He knows every single hair on your head. He knows every single particle of your being. We're held together by his will. Every molecule that makes up who you are, every atom that is within the molecules that make up who you are, every subatomic particle of that atom, of every molecule that makes up who you are. God knows everything in that regard, and his divine imprint is on every single part of his creation. So God knows how many hairs you have, but God has never had to wash his own hair. God knows how a bone breaks, but God has no bones to be broken. And God imbued human blood with all of its qualities, but never shed his own blood until he did. Until he had a body of his own that was filled with human blood, that had skin that could be pierced, that had joints that could be pulled out of socket, veins that could burst, a body that could die and be buried in the ground. Yes, Jesus learned things while he was here on earth. Yes, he was God. Yes, but he also learned things while he was here. This one who had precise and complete knowledge of your digestive system, because he was the one who created your digestive system, became the one who felt hunger for 40 days in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4. Did God ever feel hunger before that? No, of course he didn't. Now, he created your digestive system, so he knows exactly how hunger works. He designed you to feel hunger. But God, on his throne in the eternal kingdom, never felt physical hunger until he did. And the one who designed your body with only a limited amount of energy every single day was the one who needed to sleep In Mark chapter 4 and verse 38, this is the one who was so exhausted at times that if he was in the back of a boat and a storm was surging around him, he could nap through that. This is the most epic napper of all time, and I'm married to an epic napper. But think about that. Until Jesus became a human being with a body that could get worn out, he had never felt exhaustion before. It's not like God ever felt exhausted. It's not like when he held the sun up, for an entire day, or when he parted the Red Sea for Moses, or when he helped miracles with Elijah and Elisha. It's not like God goes, "Whew, those miracles really knocked me out. I'm going to have to take a nap. That's why I made the Sabbath day, I guess." God never felt exhaustion the way that he felt it when he was Jesus in the flesh, sleeping in the back of a boat. The one who created a world full of fruits to be eaten and knows every single molecule of every fruit that has ever been on planet Earth became the one who experienced the disappointment of a tree that did not bear any fruit for him. You recall in the story in Mark chapter 11, he was hoping that a fig tree might offer him a snack, and there was nothing to be found on it. Not even the tosh, the fruit that you can find on a fig tree in that part of the world. And the one who set stars in their place, like God so eloquently reminds Job in the whirlwind in Job 38, became the one who struggled to carry a piece of lumber up a hill. Now that one to me is the most provocative of all. Because this earth is his footstool. It's his footstool. And if he wants to make mountains, he simply swirls them together with his fingertip. And if he wants to make galaxies, he simply speaks them into existence. And yet the one who says, "Let there be light," and every photon in the entire universe comes into existence, needed help to carry a piece of wood up a hill in the beam from the cross. So yes, Jesus learned. In the same way that you might know everything about a cupcake without ever tasting it, God knows everything about this universe. He's the creator of it, the sustainer of it. But God became flesh in the form of Jesus Christ. And he went from knowing everything about the universe to feeling the weight of the universe. And you know what? At some point, I know we don't always think about like in these terms, but you realize at some point Jesus probably got bit by a mosquito, got stung by a bee, stubbed his toe, hit his head on a beam in a house, dropped something on his foot. At some point, Jesus felt extreme hunger. We know that. At some point, Jesus tasted something that he didn't like. At some point, Jesus felt lonely. At some point, Jesus felt disappointed and betrayed. And those are things by experiential knowledge that Jesus never knew sitting at the right hand of the Father. Loneliness, betrayal, despair, loss. And Isaiah 53 so rightly puts it that he became a man of sorrows for our sakes. The one who was so acquainted with grief. God has complete knowledge of the creation, but that is not the same thing as experience. Which leads us to a very interesting question that you may be asking yourself at some point. My aunt and I were talking about this just the other day, actually. We were speculating about what it was that Jesus learned while he was growing up. And there's a couple of verses that you find here early on in the book of Luke that don't give you probably all the information that you wished you had, but gives you at least a little bit of a clue into what it must have been like for Jesus. But imagine how humbling it was for Jesus, the Son of God, to go from being the creator of the universe who sustains everything by the power of his will to being a little tiny baby that, without any disrespect meant at all, had no control of his bowels, had no ability to speak, it couldn't walk. slobbered all over himself. When we see babies, we love babies. They're adorable. They're wonderful. But have you ever seen a baby just spit up all over itself and then smile like it's no big deal? Now, I say that kind of jokingly, but we don't always realize how humiliating it is that you could be the Son of God, right? The universe at your fingertips. The earth is your footstool. And somehow or another, the very being of the Son of God gets stuffed into the body of a tiny little baby that can't do anything except what babies are known to do. So in Luke chapter 2, it says here in verse 40, "And the child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." Wait a minute, again, are we talking about the Son of God here? How can the Son of God increase in wisdom? Well, if we're not talking about technical knowledge but experiential knowledge, it makes more sense then, doesn't it? He increased in wisdom because he increased in experience. And every time the little boy Jesus felt something, tasted something, saw something, experienced something for the very first time, that was the Son of God going, "Oh, so that's how that tastes. Oh, that's how that feels. Ooh, that really does hurt." You go on near the bottom of the page there in verse 52, "And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with men." And to me, I think this is a very useful point to consider here, that, when we read verses like this, there's a lot of theories out there about when did Jesus become the Son of God? Well, he was always the Son of God from the very beginning. Always has been and always will. There's not some kind of first century Docetism going on like that. He was always the Son of God. But he experienced things, and as he experienced earthly experiences, his wisdom, his experiential knowledge increased. But let's get back to Hebrews 5 and verse 8, because that's more of the point of this lesson is, what did he learn in his suffering? Because Jesus eating apples and stubbing his toe is one thing, and it's fun to speculate a little bit about stuff like that, but that wasn't the main point of his life. That wasn't the main point of what he was experiencing, what he was learning, what he was doing. Going back to our main text, it says there in Hebrews 5 and verse 8, "Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation." Jesus didn't merely come to earth as a human being to taste fish for the first time or appreciate how frustrating facial hair can be. He came so that he could learn something from his suffering. And defined so appropriately as the man of sorrows in Isaiah 53, he knew it was his mission to take on flesh and sacrifice it to make salvation possible. Here's a passage in James chapter 1 that we don't typically think about in the context of Jesus himself. We usually look at James chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 as a verse about us, like our suffering, like what do we gain from our suffering? But I think James 1 is also what Jesus gained from his suffering. And there's an appreciation factor that we learn when we see the connection between our suffering and his. It says in James chapter 1 and verse 2, and perhaps you know it by heart, it's one that brings great comfort to people who are going through times of suffering. It says there in verse 2, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing," he says in verse 3, "that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And endurance isn't the end result," he says in verse 4. "Let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete," he says, "lacking in nothing." Now, we don't like the suffering itself. Nobody does. And I don't think God expects you to. I don't think God expects you to enjoy chemotherapy. I don't think God expects you to laugh like it tickles when you break a bone. I don't think God doesn't expect you to just kind of like grin and bear it and have a great day when your marriage is falling apart around you. But to consider it all joy when you encounter various trials is not a recommendation or a suggestion, it's a commandment. You know why? Because the suffering itself isn't joyful. The end result is. It says there in verse 4, so that you can be what? Perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. You never arrive at perfect and complete, lacking in nothing, until you pass through the crucible of your various trials. Perfect and complete never happens without the trials. Now, I think it's less than a coincidence that in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, we see the same terminology of Jesus. He learned obedience through his suffering. Why? What does it say there in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9? And having been made perfect. Wait a minute. James 1 says that we can be made perfect and complete, lacking in nothing because of our suffering. Hebrews chapter 5 says Jesus became perfect because of his suffering as well. It's applied in a very similar way a couple of chapters back in Hebrews, in what is my favorite passage in the book of Hebrews, by the way. In Hebrews chapter 2. And I know that we're running out of time here for what's allotted for this lesson, so we don't have time to look at all of Hebrews 2, though you really want to, don't you? But in Hebrews chapter 2, it says in verse 10, and this is an explanation for why it is that Jesus came in the flesh. Like, I think we ask sometimes, like, well, why couldn't Jesus have just come in why couldn't he have just appeared as like a 500-foot tall, like, golden colossus or something, and just like stomped around the earth going, do as I say, do as I say. I mean, he could have if he'd wanted to. If he'd wanted to. So why, of all the things that Jesus could have been, of all the manifestations that the Son of God could have come to earth in, why did he come as a dirt-poor nobody from Galilee, the backwoods Galilee? And Hebrews 2 tells you why. Because it was fitting for him. I like that first of all. That could be the end of the chapter, and that would be an acceptable answer. You know why? Because it was fitting. Don't question God. Because it was the way God chose to do it, and it was fitting. It was appropriate. But he gives you more explanation than that. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect. Oh, there's that word again. We saw it in James 1. We saw it in Hebrews 5. To perfect. To perfect the author of their salvation through what? Sufferings. Again, with the sufferings. You don't get to the perfection without the sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he's not ashamed to call them brethren. He calls us brethren. That humbles me. That embarrasses me. Because I'm not worthy to be called his brother, but he's not ashamed of it. Not ashamed to call me his brother. Skip on down a little bit here in verse 14. Since then the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in that which he suffered, he is also able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. You know why Jesus didn't come as a giant golden colossus? You know why he didn't come as just a figure in the clouds? You know why he didn't just come as a big guilt-tripping finger in the air pointing at you? So that every time you felt lonely, the Son of God could put his arm around you and say, I know exactly how you feel. So that every time a friend of yours betrayed you, Jesus could know exactly what it was like. So that when your body hurts, as our bodies often do, when our health fails us, when our sides are pierced, just like with Thomas, Jesus can reach out his hand and say, these are pretty rough wounds too. I get what you're going through. so that every horrible, life-defining experience that we have to walk through in this life, Jesus could commiserate with our pain and our suffering and pave the way to our perfection. Because you never get to perfect and complete without the suffering. Let me give you 3 applications and then the lesson will be yours. First is this: we need to see suffering as a teaching moment and not just something to get through. I think we have that attitude sometimes where everything is about how quickly can we just move this process along. And there's certainly nothing wrong with wanting to get out of an uncomfortable situation. I mean, we cherish our bodies, we nourish our bodies, we take care of our bodies. There's a reason why when your body gets wounded, the first thing you do is you cradle it, you coddle it. That's reasonable. But there are some things that we have to go through. There's no quick way through it. When you have marital troubles, there's no magic answer or silver bullet. There's no quick way through marriage problems. Raising kids, right? There's no way to speed that up and like the easy way, take the next exit, the next off-ramp through child rearing. Our bodies do fail us too. And unfortunately, there is no convenient, easy, quick way to get through old age or various illnesses. And so we need to see suffering as a teaching moment. Take the time to reflect on what a challenge or an obstacle did for you and ask yourself if you really took advantage of it, because that was God saying, read James chapter 1 again. That was an opportunity for you to get a little bit closer to being perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Did you really take advantage of that opportunity to become more perfect and more complete, lacking in nothing? Jesus learned obedience. That's an important part, isn't it? He learned obedience. He had to learn it. Obedience doesn't always come naturally to us. But he learned obedience so that, according to verse 9, we could learn obedience as well. He took the path of submission, of service, and of humiliation so that he could set the tone for his people. You remember in John chapter 13, they're all reclining at the table thinking, what a lovely Passover meal we've enjoyed tonight. And suddenly Jesus gets up from the table and he strips down and starts wearing servant's clothes. And he begins washing his disciples' feet. And in a moment of embarrassment, they're all wondering what they're supposed to do right now. Now Jesus finishes, puts his clothes back on, sits down at the table, and he makes an interesting observation about halfway through the chapter. He says, you say that I'm master and teacher, and you're right. I didn't stop being master and teacher while I was washing your feet. I'm always master and teacher. So just because Jesus goes through the path of submission and humiliation does not mean he is any less the Son of God. And your path may similarly take you through submission, through humiliation, but also through the joy of serving others. And finally, mercy comes from a place of shared experiences and sympathy. Just as Hebrews 2 says, like we read a few moments ago, Jesus had to become like us in all things so that he could understand our weaknesses and treat us graciously. One of my favorite memories of my dad was when I had slipped up big time in something. And I was so scared of looking at him again after that. So scared of even making eye contact. But instead of anger or rejection and alienation, there was sympathy. There was kindness and understanding. Because I think my dad also experienced a lot of the same temptations I did. And I think you have also. And because Jesus was tempted and tried and put through a great deal in his life just as we are, that is why on the judgment day, like 1 John chapter 2 puts it, he can be our advocate. And he can lean over to the Father and say, let's be merciful to this one. Because I experienced the same thing that he did and she did. and you did. We got to show some mercy to these people because it is tough. Father, I'll tell you what. It was tough for me, and I'm the Son of God. It's tough for them too. And that's why we find such grace in Jesus Christ, because whatever we went through, He gets it. Now, if you're not a Christian here this evening, you really ought to be. There is no other way to taste of God's grace but through His Son alone. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me, Jesus says in John 14, verse 6. He puts the gospel message so simply in Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Now, if you are a Christian and you've not been living right, now's your opportunity to learn, just as Jesus did, that in the suffering, you find your greatest strength. So whatever need you have of a spiritual nature, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing this song.